Well, I want to welcome all of you today. I'm very excited about our program. We have a very special guest with us today. Her name is Joan Becker. She's from Parkersburg, Iowa. And so, Joan, I just want to welcome you. Thank you so much for being on our program today. And I just want to say is that, you know, Joan is a person who has gone through a very difficult life tragedy. And I'm just so proud of her courage and her strength and her faith, and that she has been able to, you know, take some steps forward now in life, as she has had to deal with the struggles that certain families have to deal with, and that has to do with mental illness and how mental illness does affect, you know, all of us, either directly or indirectly. And she has written a book here entitled The Mark Becker Story, and it's entitled A Sentence to Life. And this is on mental health, tragedy, and transformation. And so I'll tell you what, I'm just so impressed, you know, by your faith and your courage, and that you've written this book. And it's a book that I'm guessing where can it be purchased?
Well, you can purchase it on Amazon, and any of the Kindle, the Nook versions are out there on Barnes & Noble. We are starting to get it into some of the university bookstores, Cedar Falls UNI campus, Waverly Wartburg campus, some of those places as well. But primarily, the Amazon would be, you know, your first
Yeah, so you can
source.
Go on Amazon.com, and that's where you can get a copy of the book, A Sentence to Life. And I would highly recommend all of you to read this. You know, Joan, as a pastor, you know, there's been times in my being a minister and working with people where you get into a situation where somebody is suffering from, schizophrenia. And one of the things that, you know, I believe there's hope that I can see is that, you know, through certain medication that, you know, some people with schizophrenia, they can go on and live a normal life. But some of these cases, their medicine makes them feel lethargic. They get off of their medicine, all of a sudden they're hearing voices. Families don't know what to do. And so oftentimes they will call on me to see what I can do to help. We will have some kind of intervention where they can be in a psychiatric care facility, but they can only hold them for 72 hours. And after that, where do they go? They're on the street. You know, the parents are just worrying so much about them. I'm worrying about them, you know, not only for their physical well-being, but for everybody else's and for the parents. And so, you know, Joan, you're here because you have been down this road.
That's absolutely right. It is a very lonely road for families. Trying to find help for their loved one and trying to understand what their loved one is going through it's very lonely, it's very wearing. You often aren't sleeping at night because they're going through so many difficult episodes. And so trying to find help can be one of the most difficult things. Trying to find, and often, Pastor, you can attest to this, often our clergy is not equipped to handle or help families going through some of this. It sounds like you've got some experience with that. But I believe a lot of education needs to take place. And I believe by speaking out and sharing what our family has gone through, it helps expose some of the gaps that exist throughout this entire process. Not just with the actual mental health treatment system, but with your law enforcement, your clergy, your education, your legislation. I mean, it's all encompassing of everyone needs to be involved to be able to help make some positive changes and to be able to help educate people.
Yeah, and how true that is, because, you know, as a clergy person, they turn to me, and it's not like I can prescribe medicine.
Right.
And as far as counseling goes, well, you really can't counsel, and to try to do an exorcism, well, that's not what this is about. It's not like somebody's demon possessed or they're struggling with mental illness. And having a degree in psychology, I know that talking about psychological things, talking about mental illness, is not easy for people. There seems to be, it's kind of taboo. There's so many stigmas with it, and like you say, it's a lonely road.
It's a lonely road. We ourselves fought that same stigma. We didn't want to admit that our son might have an illness for which many of them, there isn't a cure. Yes, there's medications that they can use that will work for a while, but we didn't want to admit that our son had something wrong with his mind. That was a stigma we had on that. That's a very typical thing because it's a very unknown illness. People don't talk about it. There's a fear about it. One thing I want to emphasize, it's a very small percentage of individuals that actually have a mental illness that results in a tragedy such as our son was involved with. I do not want the public or people to be afraid of their loved ones, people in the community, people in their churches that might have a mental illness.
Yes.
They don't need to be afraid, and they don't need to be afraid to talk about it with that individual. It's okay for them to, if that individual is willing to open up themselves and say, okay, I've got this going on, they would love nothing more for someone to say, how are you doing today? How's this day going for you? It's okay to ask people and to visit with them about that. It shouldn't be any different to ask them about their illness as if you were having heart disease or cancer. People often like to be able to share how they're feeling with those illnesses. Why is this one different?
Yeah, and so it's just that, I don't know what it is about our human nature, but that level of being uncomfortable. It's almost like we can't handle anything or anybody who's less than got it all together or perfect, but that's not the reality of life, is that people, I'm always amazed at the things that people are carrying, the burdens, but yet put on this facade like we're the all-together people, when really what I think they would like is for everybody to take off the masks, so to speak, and what we need really is for somebody who we can talk to, that we can share with, somebody who's not going to be judgmental, but compassionate and concerned.
Yes.
And so I think that's a lot of it. But as parents, you and your husband, it's David.
David, yes.
David, yes. You got 3 sons, right?
Yes.
3 sons. But then all of a sudden, when did you start detecting that there might be something with Mark as far as that he's suffering from schizophrenia? I mean, right away you don't want to believe that there's anything bad happening here, or that it's not that serious of an illness.
Right.
When were you starting to notice this?
Mark was a child, and when you're raising your family, anyone who raises a family knows this, that every one of your children are going to be different, and you want them. I mean, they are their own individuals. So Mark, even at the high school level, we started to recognize differences in him. But as parents, you're sort of struggling with, well, is this just part of his adolescence and him, reaching out and trying things? I mean, he tried marijuana when he got out of high school. He tried some harder drugs, but none of it was very long lasting, because he would come home and he would say, I know this is wrong and I don't want to live this way. And he would just stop. He wouldn't use those substances anymore. So at the time, I remember thinking, what's driving him to think he even needs to do something like this? And how much do we as parents, I mean, we took him to group counseling, to individual counseling, and we really tried to find answers. And he'd do really well when he was working with other people. It wasn't until actually after the tornado that things really switched. Mark was living out in South Dakota with his older brother at the time and working. He was an assistant manager at a grocery store, doing very well. He had really worked hard to put his life together, and he felt really good about what he was doing. But even though he appeared to be doing quite well, when we would visit, he was at the point he was communicating very openly with us. And I sensed there was something more going on. and we could be talking just like this, and Mark would almost be looking off in the distance like he wasn't even hearing me. And I would say to him, Mark, where are you? Where are you at? And what we now know is that he was having the voices in the background, and not just a few voices, thousands of voices. So if I was talking to him, he wasn't quite sure. He couldn't differentiate between the reality and the unreality of his illness. So if I'm visiting with him, it's not just me, it's thousands of other voices. And so sometimes it would take him a while to respond, because he all of a sudden realized I might have asked a question, and he would respond to it. So it was when he was, that time frame, May of 2008, that he really, right after the tornado, and that's sort of what the psychologist tells us was his breaking point. He could no longer differentiate reality from unreality.
Yeah, so when I think of Parkersburg, I always think of a community where, I don't know, people seem like it's a community of success. I mean, you look at Parkersburg, I mean, it's like a bright shining light. I mean, they seem to be successful at whatever it is, and then when tragedy strikes, it seems like the resiliency of this community, that Parkersburg comes back stronger than ever. And so what was it, like a year before this, that Parkersburg was devastated with that terrible tornado?
That is correct. A year prior to this tragedy was when the tornado took place.
And you could see at that time in Mark's life, though, that there was a change that took place, which sometimes when a big disaster, a tragedy like this strikes, it does have an effect on people.
And he decided that at that point he wanted to move back to Iowa and be close to us and to his younger brother, who was going to be in his junior year of high school. Mark wanted to be back. He wanted to watch Scott play football. He wanted to be a part of Scott's life. And we thought, well, okay, because things were starting to happen out in South Dakota. We were getting calls all times of day and night, and him saying, "It's okay, Mom, you don't have to get in my mind. I can tell you're trying to control me." He started calling home with some very bizarre statements. Our oldest son started calling home as well, saying, "I don't know what to expect. Mark, one day I can get home from work and Mark is just my brother. The next day I might come home and I don't know what I'm going to walk into." His oldest brother is this big 6'2", big guy, very strong. But he's just a teddy bear, I have to say. Anyway, but he would actually lock himself in his bedroom because he was fearful of Mark and what Mark would do. Mark became very aggressive during these episodes. So these are what we call the psychotic episodes. And it wasn't till Mark moved home, he moved home in July, and it wasn't until September that we experienced the first full-blown psychotic episode, which was very, very difficult to go through. We had no idea what was happening.
Yeah, so this is where you now cannot deny the fact that there's something seriously wrong with Mark.
That's right.
Yeah, and so you mentioned that you would go to sometimes there could be group therapy, sometimes individual counseling, and you thought that during those times that did help.
We felt like it did. Once these psychotic episodes started, though, it did result in a 7-day committal the first time. And we were very naive of how this all works or what was supposed to happen. And so we figured Mark would go to the hospital, they'd say what's wrong, they'd give him medication, and he'd come home, and life is going to be good because they figured out what's wrong with him. That is the problem, is we never did find out specific diagnosis or what was wrong with Mark. And that's where we started to experience the difficulty of the mental health system. We have all these entities who are trying so hard to help people, but we have so many gaps in the system that make it so difficult for some people to get through and get the help that they need.
Yeah, and I would have to agree with Joan that as a society, we have a lot of room to grow in this whole area of treating, taking care of, providing help for people who are suffering with mental illness and for their families. And so what are, as you've been dealing with this, prior to Coach Thomas's death, you've been dealing with this and struggling with it, and now since that time, I don't know, what would be some things that you would say, as far as addressing this now, this whole issue, what are some areas that you can see, not saying that you got the cure-all for everything,
Right.
but what could be helpful to our society at this point? What could be helpful to people who are struggling with mental illness, their families, to our society, to say, this is how we can improve?
Right.
Can you see some definite, like this is obvious things that could be done?
Well, I think communication is key. Communication, not just within your family, but you need to communicate very clearly with the providers what's going on in your home. Now, one of the barriers we faced, but it doesn't have to be a barrier, is that Mark's doctors did not want to talk to us. They felt like with the HIPAA compliance, they couldn't talk to Mark's family. That's what they've told us since this all happened. However, as I have explained to them, and I've explained in speaking to families, it's okay for you to talk to them. They can listen to what you have to say. They don't have to share what's going on in dialogue directly with your loved one, but they can listen to what the family is experiencing, and they can listen to the family explaining what these episodes are. Part of Mark's difficulty in getting a diagnosis is, of course, when he would go to the counselors, he was in a very he was very lucid and very good frame of mind. I mean, this is a deceitful illness, because you get your hopes up because he had a normal day, and the next day could just snap like this. But so it becomes a very difficult illness. But I guess communicate and don't take no for an answer. And so to look back over now, I would have gone in person to the agency and made an appointment to talk to the doctor. Mark didn't have to be there. And I would make an appointment and say, you need to hear firsthand what we are experiencing. The more detailed families can be, I kept journals, I kept notes. That's a lot of the reason I did the book. I just needed to get it out of my mind. But families need to communicate with the providers, and they need to reach out to their other family for support too. They should not think they have to hide this. This is an illness like any other illness. And as soon as we as a society can start to recognize that and bring that out into the open, the more productive our providers will be able to be, family members, individuals with these illnesses, because you're going to be able to talk about it and get that out in the open and get that help. The other thing I strongly recommend is NAMI, National Alliance for Mental Illness. We were begging for a resource like that, and we never knew about them, but they have educational programs to be able to have you as a family come in and help educate you on what that illness is doing to your loved one, what they're experiencing. And just, that's so much of it is just trying to understand what Mark was going through.
So communication and education, trying to understand, just what it is, that this is, what Mark has, and this is what you as a family are dealing with. Okay, well, once then, as an example, I'll take mission trips to New York City and work at a church. And, I'll have a visit with somebody, having a good visit with them, and it'll be in November, and I'll be inside the church, but now this person is homeless.
Yes.
And I'll be hearing voices outside of the window, and I'll look outside, and here's the same person having this conversation with this fictional person who's not there. And I think, okay, obviously, this person is out in the street, homeless, because he's suffering from schizophrenia. And
Very common.
And as I've worked with homeless, like going on mission trips to like inner city New York, a lot of them are on the street and homeless because they are mentally ill.
That's correct. Yes.
And so I'm kind of thinking, okay, we know that this person's suffering from schizophrenia, but there's got to be a better way of taking care of these people than just simply saying you're going to live on the street on a cold November night now.
We need the ability for certain diagnoses to have the ability to give that person a stable environment. And that might mean an inpatient environment. And I'm not talking about a hospital. I'm even talking about a group home situation that you have qualified staff that provides, and they provide a home for these individuals. These individuals can be very productive and they can have a good life, but they need hands-on guidance, making sure they're taking their meds, making sure they're complying. And it takes a long time for certain illnesses to be stabilized. Your 72 hours or 7 days in a hospital inpatient unit are not going to cut it. You're talking 6 to 12 months before you maybe can even get it diagnosed, get them started on medication, and find out, get them stabilized, and then they can start to realize, oh my goodness, I can think again. It's not quite as severe. Yes, they're always going to have these voices, but they learn with the proper help that this is an illness and those voices are not real. Our son Mark, it took being incarcerated before he was diagnosed and started on medication. That took at least 6 to 9 months before he was not terribly delusional in hearing the thousands of voices, and that he actually started to know us as his parents again and his brothers as his brothers again. It took a long time. So when you see that and you hear that, you know that is what's needed for a small percentage of these individuals.
Yeah, so in the case of Mark and people who suffer from paranoid schizophrenia or other various forms of schizophrenia, just, that I guess we can't just treat each, everybody who suffers with mental illness all in the one big cookie cutter here, that we have to look at and to say, well, in this case, somebody's going to have to be held for more than 72 hours, or this is a prescription where somebody's going to have to be in this care facility for months, and making sure that they are now, getting on a level, like you say, there's no cure, but through medication and observation, a good environment, and people who are working that's better than being in a street or being now in prison.
Absolutely, absolutely. And so the stabilization is huge, and even the opportunity to diagnose them is huge. And so that's a huge gap in our system, huge gap. It's not a one-stop shop. It's not a one-size-fits-all. And we've got to get beyond that. And yeah, they have laws in place to cover the bulk, but there's got to be an avenue for these individuals to be able to have a chance at a productive life.
Well, here again, the book, Sentenced to Life. I would really encourage you to get a copy and to read this. And so, Joan, as I think about, obviously what happened was a terrible tragedy with Mark. And when you think of tragedies, life storms, greater or lesser degrees, that can really either crush us as people or we can go on. And I'm a firm believer that God can work good out of even the most difficult circumstances. And that's what's going through my mind right now as I look at your book and as you are now speaking, that you are being an advocate now for those who suffer from mental illness to be out there to trying to make a difference. And so I'm just thankful that in the midst of all this darkness, that a light is shining. And I'm just so thankful that God has taken you now to be, in a sense, a spokesperson for this, to be, maybe a face to say, let's change some things here. And I know you are a strong believer and you've got a strong faith, and that has really helped you during this time, hasn't it?
Absolutely. My husband and I, for us, it was so, I mean, we would not even have a family unit anymore without our faith and without God being at the core of who we are individually and as a couple and as a family. That's the way we raised our family. And when this happened, one of the biggest things I think God kept laying on my heart is you need to speak out in the efforts to give other people hope and encouragement and boldness not to sit back when they are going through situations like this. And I don't care what kind of tragedy or life storm you are going through. For all of us, that might be to a different degree, but it's just as intense no matter what the circumstances are. But the beauty of it is nothing can knock you down. God can lift you up out of the ashes, and He can make such good come from even the most devastating situations. And I just want people never to lose that hope. I want them to hold on to that and realize God He has something you can do. And it might be because of what you've gone through and experienced. You can be a voice, not just for mental illness, but for that underlying faith. I don't know where I would be without.
Yeah, so Joan, I just really want to thank you for coming on the show here today. And I think about being a wounded healer. You're certainly being that you certainly have been wounded in life, but now you got a message of hope and healing, that God is using you and through you, and that's what we need today, is that we all need to be encouraged in this whole area of mental illness and what we can do, and to try to make life a little bit more bearable for a lot of people who struggle with this, and also their families. And so, Joan, thank you for coming on the program today.
Thank you, Pastor.
Keep up your good work, and I want to thank all of you for joining us this day as well.